Yeah, so generally, if it's right on the edge, they'll sometimes go further along. You heard, I think, earlier in the broadcast and probably saw online that originally they might take it all the way to an hour prior, and that hour is kind of a key point because that's when they decide to start loading propellant on the rocket. And once you do that, then you have to unload all the propellant. That's where you have to clear the area and things like that. So they'll typically take it that far if it's maybe right on the boundary. But if things are trending worse or pretty clearly out of limits, so on a lot of these things, it's not necessarily a totally black and white answer. There's some margins, so they maybe say it's like green, yellow, red. But if it's, I don't know, but if it's like yellow but going red and continuing to go worse, then that would be a decision. It's better just to stand down versus continuing to go further in the process. Because like I said, now you're doing things like exercising valves, pressurizing lines, all that kind of stuff. That it's just better to not have to undo all those things. It just makes it easier to turn everything around.
Right, and there's a lot of coordination that goes to monitoring the ascent corridor. Obviously NASA and SpaceX teams are keeping a close eye on all those conditions you talked about, but we also engage the Department of Defense, right?
Right.
We engage them in terms of actually recovering our astronauts.
Yeah, so it's quite the choreography. So I mean, just locally, the Space Force supports with the weather forecast and analysis. But the bigger thing that you're alluding to is all up and down the eastern seaboard. There's units on standby to help with recovery if there's anything for both the rocket or the crew, if anything's off nominal. And so all those units have to be coordinated with and ready to go. And you can see, I think they're draining something. So just in the vein of like things that, prep and stuff that's happening, you can see at the bottom left there some water coming out of the acoustic tower. So that I'm speculating, but that probably had some pressure in it. And now that they've paused the clock, they're releasing that pressure. So all those kind of things, you can imagine all that water that's coming out, you have to refill that water. So all those things have to happen after a scrub. So the earlier you can make that call, the less amount of those kind of things you have to go back and do.
So what happens now? So obviously the crew was just informed that we're standing down from tonight's launch attempt. So what happens? What are like the standard operating procedures?
It kind of depends on where along the point you scrub. In this particular case, since they haven't actually gone out to the pad, it should be a relatively quick, basically they'll doff the suits, so go back to the suit up room with the suit team's help, get out of the suits, because the last thing you want to do is rush to get out of them and then, damage a suit. So they'll use the suit team to help doff out of those. And then it'll be kind of like Groundhog Day. They'll, if there's anything in particular with their flight mission profile, so for example, like if they have an upcoming EVA or maybe a really important science payload or some kind of robotic operation, they would probably use this time over the next 24 hours to maybe review that. And then also probably start, so that's one thing they could do. And then they'll also probably start briefing and talking about what the rendezvous timeline is for this new window. Because like I said, it's always different depending on the orbital phasing. So they'll pretty quickly here, if they haven't, my guess is they probably already do have already have thought through all this, or the flight docs have. They'll kind of build a schedule like, okay, now that you're launching 23 hours later, this is your rendezvous timeline, and we need to sleep shift you, 2 hours right or left or whatever it is. And so that's probably the other thing that's happening is figuring out, okay, you need to go to bed right now, or no, we need to stay up for a few hours and then go to bed and going through that kind of drill. But because they didn't come out to the pad, it's much, it is actually a lot easier on the crew. They're going to have the opportunity to get a lot more rest than they would otherwise, because if they'd come all the way out to the pad, got strapped in, basically everything you do, you have to undo. So this is, at least for their timeline and their prep for tomorrow, probably a good scenario for them.
This is a live view of inside the White Room, which is at the end of the crew access arm and their way into the Dragon spacecraft. Teams here are obviously doing things to secure and as you were saying, like really prep for tomorrow again, I'm assuming.
Yeah, and the other thing, it's not just the people that the Endeavor's taking up there, it's also cargo, and part of that cargo is what's called powered cargo, and so some of the highest end science that's going to and from the space station goes on Dragon vehicles, because you can come back down and then you can get further analysis on the ground. But what that means is that once you get closer to launch, that power comes from internal power of the vehicle. It goes on to what we call Dragons powering it, or the vehicles powering it. But to keep it here overnight, it's going to go back on to umbilical power. So the pad and the ground support equipment will will supply that. And in some cases, depending on what it is, I mean, there might be, if you can imagine if there's like human research type stuff or like tissue sample, that kind of stuff, you might actually offload it and then put it back on. And so again, there's a whole bunch of stuff happening beyond just what the crew is doing.
And we were talking about sleep shifting and all that stuff. It doesn't just apply to the astronauts, it applies to this crew as well.
Right. Yeah, everyone's, the flight control team, both in Houston, here at KSC, and at Hawthorne, everyone's going to basically shift to whatever to be ready for the next window.
The good thing is that, as you said, family has remained in quarantine, so our astronauts will get some more family time before
Exactly.
they.
Yep. Yeah, and like I mentioned, that's the importance of staying in quarantine, because now they can still have that time with their families.
One last shot of Falcon 9 and Dragon Endeavour on launch pad 39A here at Kennedy Space Center.
And I'll throw in Tom Marshburn to the rescue. Send It was the Crew 3 license plate with the E as a 3.
I was dying to know. Again, one last shot of what will be Crew 8's ride to space, just not tonight. Again, standing down for unfavorable weather. The team's now repositioning themselves for a launch attempt tomorrow, March 3rd. T0 liftoff time targeted for 10:53 p.m. Eastern Time. And coverage, if you want to join us again, begins at 6:45 p.m. Eastern. We roped in Raja for
I'll be back.
another attempt. He'll be back. So we hope you can join us then. For now, have a good night. Thank you so much for tuning in.